All right, so we will be looking at setting up an FK-IK switch for our girl's arms. That will basically give us the opportunity to switch between what kind of controls we want to drive the motion in our arms. So I'll go ahead and make this a two-parter. The first part will set up basically the controls for both of them at the same time. And then in the second part, we'll actually build the switch, which gives us the ability to toggle between which control type that we get to use. So again, to review, right, like the IK or the inverse kinematics, that's like what our legs do, where, there's one solver at the end of a joint chain that automatically bends things for us. And then there's also FK or the action figure style, which is how we have our spine set up, right? So if we rotate something higher up in the hierarchy, it'll move everything else beneath it. But something else, further on in the hierarchy won't affect those who are actually above it in terms of parenting. So we'll basically build the option to do both of those different controls. And just as a caveat is that this would work with our reverse foot setup as well. You just have to be a little bit more cognizant of how you get your parenting set up, especially as it relates to the IK handles and your little shoebox control. Let's go ahead and get started for getting this set up for the arms. First thing I want to do is I'm going to duplicate these joint chains, and the things that I want to move FK and IK style independently, I want to keep those. So this can be my shoulder, my elbow, and my wrist. I'm not going to keep the hands or the fingers. So, once I have this joint chain selected, I'll hit Control D again. And with my cursor over the outliner, I will hit F to find it. And I'm just going to delete everything beneath the wrist. So I don't need any hands. I don't need any fingers, right? Like this isn't going to matter. So I'll delete it. Now I just have LT shoulder, elbow, and wrist. I'll go ahead and rename these to my LT FK underscore shoulder. And I'll even use comment rename to help me out there as well. But I'm just renaming this to be my FK joints. So LT with LTFK and replace. And I will do the same thing. I'll duplicate this again, but I'll just make this IK instead of FK. So hit Control D, again with that shoulder selected. Grab everything, search for FK, and replace with IK. There we go. Remove that one, just because I don't want it there. And let's go ahead and do some tricky constraints. So just like we've done before with our previous reverse toe setup, we do want to constrain this in a very particular order by using some parent constraints. So what I really want you to pay attention to is that I want to grab the original shoulder, the thing that our girl is actually skinned up to, right? So if I move this, the arm moves. I want to grab this last. Even though I duplicated these and I move these joints, I'm not actually getting anything else to move, because we're basically going to change what joint chain is the parent of our main arm when we build this switch. But for now, let's just get those constraints down. So I'm going to grab my LTIK wrist, hold down Control, grab my LTFK wrist, keep holding down Control, and grab my LT wrist last. So you could have done FKIK wrist or IKFK wrist. You just want to make sure that you grab the wrist last, right? I'll go up to Constrain, down to Parent, and over to the Options box, because I want to turn Maintain Offset off in this particular instance. Usually we don't do that, right? I always have us check that, but for this one, we do want that to that Maintain Offset to be off, because we want those to be exactly inside of each other. I'll go ahead and hit Apply. So now I will have, a parent constraint under my wrist. Let's go ahead and do the same for the elbows and the shoulders. I'll grab my LTIK elbow, hold down Control, grab my LTFK elbow, hold down Control, grab my LT elbow. Again, I have Maintain Offset off. I'll hit Apply again. New parent constraint. Same for the IK shoulder. I'll hold down Control and grab the FK shoulder. And finally grab the LT shoulder, the original one, last. I'll hit Add so this menu vanishes. So now I have three different parent constraints, which, if you pay attention over here, there's a W0 and a W1 attribute that we will mess with once we get to the second part. But to double check and make sure that this is behaving how I like it for our switch, you need to either select your LTFK shoulder or your IK shoulder, not the original one, and just go ahead and grab a Move tool and just pull this out. And I'll go ahead, because, this looks a little weird and it's kind of distracting. I'll hide the visibility on my girl's geometry as well. But what I'm looking for is for our main hand, the one that's actually skinned to our geometry, right, to split the difference between, the shoulder that we're manipulating, in this case our IK shoulder, and then the one that's staying behind our FK shoulder. So, if I move this, our hand is going to be in between both of those. If I even rotate it, I get something similar. You know, it looks a little weird, got like some Doctor Strange action going on, right? But even if I rotate my IK shoulder, again, even though this goes all the way back, that regular arm, our original arm, is going to be sort of striated 50% halfway through the joint that we're manipulating and the one that's staying behind. You know, if I grabbed this and moved it forward, it would still do its best to sort of split that difference. That's how we know that our setup is working. So now that we know that our setup is working, let's go ahead and build controls for these joints one at a time. And once those are, you know, built and constrained up, then we'll finish this out by making our switch. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my LT-FK shoulder. I'm going to build my FK controls first. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to use my isolate select to go ahead and solo it out in the viewport. And, you know, it's okay that we don't see anything else. We'll use some cute little tactics to align our FK shoulder controls to be aligned with our joint orientation so that it behaves in a way that we would prefer. So I'll go ahead and just make some good old classic hoops as my control curves. I'll go to my curves and surfaces, make a NURB circle. And what I want to do is I want to change to my move tool, hold down V as in victory, and snap this up to the inside of my shoulder. I'm also going to scale this up a little bit, right? And I do want to rotate this 90 degrees on Z. So when we, you know, align this up via rotation, it'll be pointed down at the bone, you know, this hoop faced the way it needs to be, as opposed to, you know, having, you know, the long part of this aimed down the bone and, you know, behave in a way that we wouldn't like. So just make sure that you're rotating this upright before we get this started. You know, I have this scaled up to what I think is appropriate, and it's where it needs to be in space, so I will run a modify freeze transformations. And while I'm here, I'll rename my nerve circle to LT FK underscore shoulder underscore CTL. And let's go ahead and throw this in a group. So Control G to group, and I can just run modify center pivot so that my pivots are exactly the same. And like we did with our reverse foot control, we can also use match pivots, but that one's just slightly faster. I'll also rename this group, you know, as opposed to underscore CTL, I'll make that a lowercase CTL and add a group. Now this is where it gets fun. What we're going to do is we're going to use the group to hold some junk data and hold the rotation for us, so it's, you know, aimed down the bone the way it needs to, while keeping our transforms inside of our actual control curve clean. So in order to do that, select your group first, hold down Shift, and click on the joint. This has the orientation that we want this to hold, right? And we will do a match rotations. So again, I grabbed the joint first, held down Shift, and grabbed the bone. And now I'm going to go up to Modify, Match Transformations, Match Rotation. Now if you'll notice, my control curve is pointed the way that it needs to be. It's going to go down the bone. And even if I change my axis orientation back to object, we can see that the primary axis of this, my x-axis, is aimed down the bone at the next joint. So just like our joint orientation, right? And you know, if I click on my group here, I am holding junk in my rotation, which is fine, because if I'm an animator and I go and grab this curve to animate on, this is still cleaned out. And I can, you know, mess up this rotation as much as I'd like, but if I zero the rotation out here, I am back to being oriented the direction that the bone is facing. So that is the ideal setup. We want, again, this group to hold junk for us, which is fine, as long as our FK shoulder control, the actual curve itself that we would animate, right, as long as that is clean, all is well. So let's go ahead and repeat that process for the rest of the joints. So go ahead and duplicate this, hold down V to snap it to the joint. And since I want to work cleanly here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to zero out the rotation on the group itself so I can get this zeroed out. I'm going to run a modify freeze transforms so I can get this translate X, Y, and Z to be a little bit cleaner. I have to modify, freeze transformations, and let it go. And I'll go ahead and duplicate this and snap it to the wrist, and we'll use that match transforms a couple of different times. So again, I'll duplicate this, hold down V, snap it to the wrist, and since my rotations are already zeroed out, I can freeze transforms again. But the reason I'm doing that, right, is I do just want to make sure that these are zeroed out before my rotations are zeroed out. So this will be, you know, up and down before I freeze transforms, because if I freeze transforms with, you know, our junk rotations on, let's go ahead and see what that looks like. And I go ahead and pay attention to the pivot, right? This is going the right way, but if I do a modify, oops, freeze transformations, now my pivot is no longer aligned. And even if I click on my FK shoulder, that pivot is still going to be messed up as well. So that's something we want to be careful of. You know, if we're going to freeze transforms to clear out our translate X, we do want to make sure that the rotates are all zeroed out and that they're all clean before we run that freeze transforms. And again, all those operations that I'm doing are on the group. So I'll modify freeze transformations again, and let's use that match rotations to get that rotation matched up. So I'll select this group. This is what my elbow is supposed to be. I'll hold down shift and grab the bone. Let's modify match transformations and match rotation. Same for this last group. Again, I'll select the group, hold down shift, click on the wrist joint, go up to modify, match transformations, match rotations. All right, I'll go ahead and rename these as well, right? So these were my FK shoulder controls, but I want to make this my FK elbow instead. And repeat that for the actual control curve. Because again, I just want everything to be organized and named nicely. And I'll use comment rename for my wrist. So search for shoulder and replace with wrist. Run it. Get rid of that 2 at the end just to keep things nicely organized. All right. So next what we're going to be gunning for is that stair-step shape before we begin to constrain things up. So I'm going to grab my wrist, hold down shift and grab my elbow control and use P to parent. And grab my elbow control group, hold down shift to grab my shoulder and use P to parent. So you know, if I bring this open, just like we have with our spine, we're getting that stair-step hierarchy transformations. Again, this is something that's really important that I'm looking for, right? If I click through on the different actual control curves, notice in the channel box and layer editor, they're still zeroed out. And something you might notice as I'm clicking through the groups is there's still junk in the rotation. Click through the other group. There is now junk in the translate as well as the rotation, and same for the child underneath that. That is okay as long as the actual control curve, like our CTLs, those are zeroed out. Again, we're using this empty group to more or less hold that junk data for us so we can still keep clean transformations further on down the line. And something else I might do is I might on isolate select, bring back the visuals for my girl. And if I want to adjust the scale of these, I can do that. I just want to do it now before I constrain things up and have this drive, or have these curves drive the motion of my actual joints. If I do want to scale this down, do make sure that I operate on the CTL. I don't want to do this on the group. I do want to do it on the CTL. So, you know, I can smush this wrist down a little bit, modify freeze transformations, and I'm okay with that. If I did want to do this on the elbow control, right, if I scale this down, it's affecting what's underneath it, so I might have to unparent those, then scale down my FK elbow controls, and then run a modify freeze transformations. And again, I'm doing that on the actual curve, not the group, because if I do a freeze transforms on the group, you remember, now our transform is going to be all messed up. So I'll go ahead and undo before that, just right after I fix my scale. Now if that scale is looking good where I want it to, where I want it to be, I can go ahead and parent this back up. Cool. So I'll have this selected. I'll go back up to my FK joints and I'll hit Control to grab this. I'll use Isolate Select to, again, hide these and isolate them so I don't mess up anything else. And let's go ahead and do some parent constraints. So select my curve, hold down Shift and grab the bone, go up to Constraint, down to Parent. And I'm going to turn Maintain Offset back on, because again, if I turn it off, things might snap where they're not supposed to be. So I'll Constrain, Parent, and make sure Maintain Offset is checked back on. Go ahead and Apply. Grab my elbow, curve, Shift select the elbow joint, hit Apply. grab my wrist curve, hold down Shift Select, and grab the wrist and hit add. So now if I click on my curves and rotate them, they're going to start driving the motion of my actual FK bones. Grand, fantastic, delightful. So just like we did with our spines, we're sort of mimicking that stair-step hierarchy, or even how our joints are organized in the hierarchy. And it seems like everything is working as it should. Great. So now let's go ahead and repeat a similar process for the IK. I'll save that for last, right? Because it's not going to be nearly as intensive as this process. We will be using that same sort of tactic, but we'll just use it for one particular control. So I'll scroll up. I'll find my LTIK shoulder and use Control 1 or use the Isolate Select to solo it out in my viewport. And instead what I want to do before I start adding controls is that because this is an IK control, right? Let's go ahead and put in a bend and add a set preferred angle. So, scoot this forward, bring my elbow forward, Shift Select both of them, right click and set preferred angle, zero them back out. Come on, type in 0. There we go. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and add an IK handle. So I'll change to my Create IK Handle tool. Hold down Control on my keyboard, click my LTIK shoulder, and click my LTIK wrist. And now a little IK handle has been added for me. Looks like that's bending in the way that I would like it to be. Now let's go ahead and add a control for the IK handle. I'll go ahead and open my control curves, and we could make a circle, or maybe we want to use something different for what our IK handle is going to look like, because maybe we want it to be visually distinct from the circles and the rings that we used for our FK controls. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to find a thin cross. So I have that down there. I'll put it at the origin. Just like I did with my FK controls, I will go ahead and rotate this upright. So -90 on Z. I'll change it back to my move tool and hit V as in victory to snap this to the wrist. And I will use a modify freeze transformations again. So now this cross thin, I'll go ahead and rename this to my LTIK wrist control. And I'll also rename my IK handle to, LK or LTIK wrist _ HDL. And let's go ahead and start adding these to their own groups like we have done with our foot controls before. I'll go ahead and Control G to my IK wrist handle. I'll Shift Select my wrist handle and use a modify match transformations, match pivots to get those pivots exactly where they need to be. And then rename my group that holds the handle to my handle _ capital GRP. Do the same with my LTIK wrist CTL or control curve. Because again, this control curve is what's actually going to drive how our IK handle behaves. We'll hit Control G, group it out. I can do another, modify match transformations, match pivots after I select those up. And once again, rename this to my IK wrist CTL _ capital GRP. Cool. Now with this IK wrist control group selected, I'm again going to Shift Select my wrist joint, and I grab my handle, so I might use H to hide that for just a moment. Grab my group, Shift Select my IK wrist, use Modify, Match Transformations, Match Rotations. So now this is pointed directly down the wrist. And again, our group is holding that junk for us. Now, I don't have any fancy parenting to do, right? Since it's just the IK handle. So we won't need to do anything else here aside from get those constraints down. So let's grab my IK wrist control. Go ahead and control click my IK wrist handle. And let's go ahead and add a parent constraint. So constrain down to parent. So now anytime I make a movement or a motion on my control, the IK handle will also work with it. And lastly, something that we didn't do with the FK controls, but we do need to do with the IK controls, is we'll add a little bit of a orient constraint constraining the wrist CTL to the actual wrist joint. So if we rotate this, it'll rotate the wrist joint as well. So, right now I'm trying to move this, manipulate it, but the actual wrist joint itself isn't moving. So I'll step back to get this back to where it needs to be rotated. And again, with this selected, I'll hold down Shift, grab the wrist. Again, the parent constrains the child, right? I want to constrain the cross control as the parent to the child of the wrist. Go up to Constrain, down to Orient again. Now if I grab and move this, you can see that the joint inside is also rotating with it. Cool beans. Let's see here. And I think one last thing that we'll do is, like we did with our legs, we'll add a pull vector control for the arm. And I will open up my curves again. I'll find that curve 4 arrows thin, drop it down to the origin. So again, hold down V to snap it to the elbow, because the elbow is the middle of our IK chain, right? Once we use a pull vector to control it, we want to make sure that, this is aligned to the actual elbow. So I'll scoot this back in space, and even unisolate select so I can get a better view of where this needs to be. Go ahead and rotate this up in space. Modify, freeze transformations. Control G to group it. Run a modify, center pivot. Again, I just want the pivots of my group to be the same as where those curved 4 arrows are. And let's go ahead and rename these controls. So the curved 4 arrows, make this LT underscore, elbow. Let's actually do IK underscore elbow underscore PV CTL. Now there's a lot going on here, but since this is specifically for the IK elbow and not the FK elbow, right, I do want to make that distinction. I'll copy that name, graft it to the group, just make the CTL lowercase, and add a capital GRP at the end. Now let's go ahead and add that actual pull vector constraint. So I'll click my pull vector control curve. I can grab through the viewport or through the outliner. Hold down Control, click the LTIK wrist, run a constrain, pull vector. So now if I, move my IK control, and it'll probably be a little difficult to tell here. Let's see if we can't get a good result. And I move my pull vector with it. I can now control where this is pointing. Good. And still doing that thing where it splits the difference, and that is okay. Go ahead and undo till this is back to where it needs to be. And now you notice we've even got sort of like this little ghosting thing going on where this is slightly popped out of place because of our IK control, and that is completely fine. Once we get the switch set up, it'll make a lot more sense and how that can be useful to us. But that said, we'll go ahead and call it there for building this control. We'll go ahead and, in the second part, add our own attributes on our own curves to help drive that motion and switch between the FK and the IK controls.